Growth. One of the top main things that show up in any story, may it be novels, live action shows, cartoons, or even comics. Growth is used as a story element for characters in any narrative piece. Sometimes this element is used to strengthen a character's motives, morals, or outlook on the setting they're in. It makes them feel something they hadn't felt at the beginning of the story. Pretty much character development is a usual term for when this happens in stories, and it's used often in anime and manga in ways that I really appreciate how the element is used in. It makes you feel connected to the characters you're following through the story as you get to see their perspective change from the start to the finish. It's like we're growing with them when this element is used, which is why this is one of my favorite factors when following through a story. If the main character doesn't have too good of a compelling motive at the start of the story, I usually wait and see if they eventually grow out of that stage, hoping they wouldn't stay static to such a mediocre outlook. If growth isn't used though, I'll just label them as a bland and pretty boring character that serves nothing good to the plot. But honestly, protagonists don't even really need to go through insane development through the story to be a good character, and they can still keep the same goal they had since the start of the story. But what they need to have when they follow this route is amazing and enjoyable characterization that captures the viewers. Look at Luffy, he doesn't grow all too much throughout the story of One Piece. Obviously he isn't the same person he was at the start of the story at the moment, but his motives stay the same and no life-changing development has crossed his path. But that doesn't mean he's a boring character. He is considered one of the greatest protagonists of all time due to his great and entertaining characterization that does capture the audience, which is great, and I applaud Oda for still keeping us so connected to Luffy after over 1,000 chapters. But back to talking about growth in a story. Sometimes the outcome for it could be for the better or worse. Examples for a worse outcome, or some could say a negative outcome, would be for characters to go from a stage of, well, them being a good person to becoming the total opposite of that further into the story. Obvious examples from different media are Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan, Two-Face from DC Comics, and Michael Corleone from The Godfather. All of these characters have in common is growth that they have gone through from meeting different circumstances that have changed them. And the opposite of that is what I want to be talking about today. I might save, well, quote-unquote becoming a worse person for a later video, because right now I'm going to be discussing the topic of becoming a better person in anime and manga. The characters I've chosen as examples for this each all originate from a pretty negative starting point. Well, before that starting point, they were obviously pure and good-natured children. The things that occurred in their life later on had begun that negative starting point. They each have different ways to come off from that negative starting point as well. One of them plans to kill the circumstances that ruined him, another plans to fully surpass the circumstances that brought him up, and the other has no way to go other than live as a shell of his old self, and wait for fate to open up a path for him to quote-unquote walk upon. Each of these characters have this pretty negative outlook on life. Thorfinn from Vinland Saga, Musashi from Vagabond, and Johnny from JoJo's are the ones I'm going to be discussing and see how they're able to grow out of that, well, edgy stage they had at the start of their respective series. So let's start off with talking about one of the most greatest characters to ever do this developing element well in anime and manga, Thorfinn. Thorfinn started off like any other good-natured kid. He had a pretty ordinary upbringing and a good family. His environment was tame as well, and his family barely had any problems. There was nothing too out of the blue messing with his head around these times of when he was a child. The only thing that really interested him though was the place called Vinland. It's a place that would stay in his mind to the current stages of the story. Only certain circumstances would make him stray away from the idea of Vinland. Eventually, new problems would arrive at his doorstep. A runaway slave, war approaching and his father having to leave, and his own growing desire to fight in the war. All of this kind of makes him more aggressive for a child, but I think the main thing that builds up all of this is how his father, Thors, is basically the strongest man he knows. He looks up to him and kind of wants to fight alongside him, but obviously due to him being a child, he's limited to take part in the starting up war. So when he's confronted by Thors when finding his knife, he's told one of the most iconic lines in Vinland Saga: "You have no enemies. No one has any enemies." This line remains as the central theme of Vinland Saga, and it strives to this current chapter, showing its consistency in the story and characters. After hearing this line, Thorfinn doesn't change his view. He still keeps his reckless mindset in check and even sneaks on board a ship where they're taking fighters to war. But this event doesn't make him filled with excitement or ends with him having a spark of exhilaration. This event thrust Thorfinn into a world where it would take years for him to leave from, the harsh world of fake warriors slaughtering each other for either little money or just the sake of it, a harsh world where no sane child would survive in. Thorfinn was an exception though. Seeing his father killed by Askeladd's group pushed him to survive and survive, making his only motive in life to kill the man he hates the most, the man who used petty tactics to kill the man he loved the most. Thorfinn being able to survive in the world of Vikings for a long period of time wasn't due to a strong and inspiring willpower, but a fiery rage-filled body filled by revenge and anger. A negative outlook was put onto Thorfinn in this stage because he didn't care about anything else. He barely had any morals at this point of time. He just had one thing to care about in life, which was to kill Askeladd. Time goes by and Askeladd dies. Bang, stabbed through the heart by the most unexpected person to do so. Here we have Thorfinn in pure shambles. His only motive and goal in life had been taken away from him, vanished in thin air right in front of his eyes. Not only did Askeladd die that day, but Thorfinn did as well. Thorfinn's reaction to Askeladd's death can be considered a reaction to a loved one's death, but it's far from the case. This man had just seen the guy he wanted to kill taken away from him. Thorfinn's quote-unquote death could be said to be at this point of the story, which is the reason why he's so lifeless in the arc afterwards, the one he actually starts to change. The Farmland arc serves as a major life-changing section for Thorfinn's life, which makes him finally be able to transition from a lifeless, hollow shell to a person with big dreams of peace. Thorfinn truly became a better person due to friendship, loss, and his final resolve. His friendship with Einar had kind of pushed him on to find joy in his life once again. At the farm, he was pretty much a robot. He did anything he was told to with no sort of choice made by himself. Basically a hollow puppet that would listen to any farm higher-ups. Einar, on the other hand, was emotional and able to speak out against his superiors. Him and Thorfinn collide together to make an unlikely friendship. With this relationship made, Thorfinn starts to feel again. He starts to feel what he hadn't felt for a long time, that joy of life. Without Askeladd, he became nothing, hollow and empty. But that's the good thing. For Thorfinn to be reborn, empty is the best way to be. Him facing his sins in his dream state around the beginning of the arc is where Thorfinn finally confronts the horrors of his past and thinks of changing himself for the better. For him to finally become a true warrior his father had been, he plans to never harm a person ever again. Through this rebirth, he'll make amends for what he has done and becomes a better person. Thorfinn's emptiness was key to his change and key to his development. The loss of his goal was unexpectedly the greatest thing that came from his character arc. It's how he comes off from that, where he fills up that void inside of him with better things than before. That is where he is reborn as a better person. So Thorfinn needed a lack of ambition and a load of emptiness for him to truly become a better person. Let's talk about the next two now. Musashi Miyamoto from Vagabond, a swordsman literally brought up in the opposite way of Thorfinn. Thorfinn at least had a regular start to his childhood. Musashi, or Shinmen Takezo, at the time was forced by his father to train in martial arts. His father was basically a renowned swordsman in the nation and was also a very prideful one, and like what any other strongly prideful swordsman would do, he would force his son into studying the arts of the sword. Takezo had become an outcast due to this. His behavior was savage-like due to his upbringing, and people had feared coming close to him. Takezo would eventually be able to kill a literal swordsman at the age of 13 as well, making more people afraid of this child's skills. Being an outcast, he didn't grow to have too many connections and barely had any emotional attachment to humans, which would go on to explain how he was easily able to kill as many people as he could later in the manga. Musashi's negative start would of course begin with his upbringing and him becoming a swordsman later on, hunting superior opponents, even opponents who didn't even want to fight anymore. He didn't care that much though. All he cared about was becoming invincible under the sun, proving not only to superior swordsmen that he's better than them, but his father as well. This goal had blinded his view on life, causing his reckless and violent attitude. Being blinded, he didn't see the true value of his own life as well. Musashi wouldn't start to grow until he had met Takuan, pretty much a guardian for him and a teacher as well. Takuan's role in the story would to try and keep Musashi in check whenever he sees him. He always has lessons to tell him, and eventually some of Takuan's words finally hit Musashi that make him change for the better. Takuan had told Musashi that his way of life is not meant for him, but was drilled into his head. Reading through the manga, I can definitely see how Musashi wasn't entirely a bad person at the start of the story. The way he treated his only friends and people who came in contact with him was not that bad, but what I can say is that he definitely had a dangerous mindset. Kill or be killed is the only way in life. It's a mindset that's not worth it, and it would finally be realized by him further into the story. In the arc that serves as the aftermath of Musashi killing 70 people by himself, he sits down and thinks about the sins he had committed, the spiral of death and killing he had entered, a cycle of him slaying people over and over again. The cycle where he keeps coming out on top, but at what cost? He became invincible under the sun, he reached his goal, but was it worth it? He didn't become stronger in any way. Killing different men didn't make him stronger, it just made him descend in the spiral of death and killing even more. Musashi finally met realization in the Aftermath arc, and had finally learned that being invincible under the sun is just like a heat haze. I'm going to explain what he meant by that using the words of someone I found on a Reddit post, credit down in the description. Being invincible under the sun is just a heat haze, being surrounded by a soft air, an air of confidence. That is the feeling of being invincible, but when his enemies are surrounded in that air, he becomes invincible by human standards. Enemies surrounding him that he doesn't even know about, but he still needs to kill them in order to maintain that invincibility. And that's what Musashi meant by it's just a heat haze. Invincible under the sun is just like a mirage, a heat haze, an illusion that disappears quite quickly. Musashi learning all of this just gave him the biggest shock of his life, and just like he said, it took him 22 years to learn all of that. After this, Musashi begins his journey on finding out what he could do in his life with this new knowledge. He eventually is able to come to realize that he's able to connect through the heavens through the most simplest things like carving Buddhas or feeling the earth around him. We see this more specifically in the farming arc. Musashi learns to connect to people around him and the heavens. He doesn't need to kill people to become connected to the heavens. He starts to grow to a more reserved, understanding, and respectable individual. He becomes a better person. So Musashi's way is basically realization and coming to terms with his lifestyle. By overcoming that and creating new paths for a connection to the heavens, he becomes better than he was at the start of the story. Oh, and also, his smile is amazing. Now for the last person, Johnny Joestar from JoJo's Part 7 Steelbook Run. Now this guy, his character became great and has a really solid character arc in the span of only 95 chapters. Johnny's upbringing, while similar to Thorfinn's calm and ordinary start, he's different in a way that he has wealth. So he's pretty much a rich kid while still having strict rules in the household, especially held out by his father. His childhood started off pretty well, but like all anime and manga protagonists, they always don't turn out too ordinary or calm, and a load of stuff hit them hard. The rat situation with his brother dying, his father, well, going mad about it and isolating Johnny, and of course the incident of George Joestar telling Johnny right to his face that God had taken the wrong son, which I can say was the last straw for Johnny, and that was where he had ended up going into his edgy state. In the stage which had occurred in his life, it ended up being that negative start that serves as a place to start growing from, but Johnny wouldn't grow until he had pretty much met with devastating consequences halting him. One of these consequences was a life-changing event that had only happened because of his selfish and arrogant mindset he had at the time. He had been shot and crippled thanks to his own actions, and it entirely was his own fault. Johnny would eventually become more depressed due to this situation and everyone actually leaving him. His father didn't even come to see him in the hospital, which just lets us know what everyone thinks of Johnny, that he's a bad person. Johnny's growth would start up at the start of the Steelbook Run race, after he had met Gyro of course, because at that time it had been the first time in a while that he had relied on someone else. By touching one of Gyro's steel balls that had been surrounded by spin, Johnny had stood up. His crippled body had actually stood up. Feeling this feeling he hadn't felt for a long time, it had made him desperate to feel that again. So he went along with Gyro and actually formed a strong friendship with him, even though it started off with Johnny selfishly wanting to stand up again. This friendship is what had connected Johnny to people again. His isolation wouldn't be a thing anymore, and he would start to grow stronger mentally as well. Strong enough to even save his friend, which would result in him losing the things that were his main goal in the story. This has shown Johnny's grand development and growth in a way that was both hopeful and pretty sad. The experiences of them together in the race built up this growth and change for Johnny, which resulted in him transitioning for the better. He became a lot less selfish and arrogant and became helpful, kind, and even selfless. In his confrontation with Valentine, we can see Johnny's new traits being fully developed. He's given a choice of giving the corpse parts away to Valentine for the country and as well as seeing Gyro again. Johnny has a major internal conflict in this chapter and he knows that it's the best choice to give the parts up for the better. But sadly, Valentine is who he is and isn't too trustable and betrays Johnny. But seeing his internal conflict was all we needed to know on how his mindset had changed from the start of the story. I might say a few JoJolion spoilers coming in next, so keep that in mind. So in JoJolion, we've seen a flashback of Johnny doing some things that had led to his death. His wife had gotten a severe sickness and the only idea Johnny had to heal it would of course being to use the corpse parts. Obviously the parts were locked away and on high security, but Johnny didn't care. He went all the way to where they were locked up, stole them and ran all the way back to his wife. He risked his life doing this, which is something Johnny at the start of Steel Baron wouldn't have done. But this act would result in him dying sadly. But the corpse parts would actually heal his wife. But that sickness would latch onto his son next, making Johnny having to retrieve the sickness himself in himself. But unfortunately, once he finishes this process, he gets shot in the head by the people who were in charge of guarding the corpse parts and later falls down from his horse, getting crushed by a big rock afterwards. It's pretty crazy how both Jonathan Joestars die with their heads being a major cause in the process. Johnny's conclusion may be sad, but it gave us the outcome of his development and that made him become a better person. His friendship with Gyro and the experiences throughout the Steel Baron race had made this happen, which is amazing and only shows how much of a great dynamic they have. Top 1 duo dynamic in manga for sure. So that's where I'm gonna end off for today. Hopefully you did enjoy. If you did, make sure to comment down below some more video ideas for the future. Getting some more videos like this in the next few weeks, so get ready for that. But anyways, like always, subscribe if you haven't, hit the like button, turn on bell notifications and follow my Twitter down below. It's been Endless Requiem, peace.